They told me it was a work thing. That was the part that stung later. Not the setup itself, not even the laughter I could hear from across the restaurant. What got me was that they'd used the word work, like it was neutral, like it meant nothing. I'd been at Meridian Logistics for about 3 years by then, long enough to know the difference between people who had your back and people who thought they did. Kyle and the others. They thought they were my friends. Maybe they were, in the way that people who see you every day for 3 years become something. You eat lunch together. You cover for each other when the manager walks by. You know each other's coffee orders and which client calls to avoid and what kind of mood everyone's in by how they hold their shoulders walking through the door on a Monday morning. I knew these people. I thought they knew me. So when Kyle texted on a Friday afternoon, "Hey, some of us are grabbing dinner at Arlo's tonight, come through," I said yes without thinking. I was 31. I'd just ended something that had lasted 8 months and felt like longer in the way that relationships do when they're slowly going wrong. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't avoiding anything either. I just thought dinner, some familiar faces, maybe a beer, home by 10. That was what I was told. And that was the worst part. Arlo's is on King Street, one of those places that feels expensive without being formal about it. Exposed brick. The kind of lighting that makes everyone look slightly better than they are. A wine list printed on a single sheet of paper so you can't see the prices until you ask. I'd been there before for a birthday. I liked it. I remember thinking it was a nice choice for a random Friday. I walked in at 7:15. Kyle was already there, and so were Damien and Priya from operations, and a woman named Tabitha who worked in our Calgary office and was in Toronto for the week. They were at a round table near the window, and they all looked up when I walked in with expressions I didn't quite register at the time. I registered them later. There was an empty chair across from a woman I didn't recognize. She looked up too. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly and then forgotten about it. She was wearing a gray blazer over a striped shirt, and she had the look of someone who had just finished a very long week. Her eyes were brown, and the first thing I noticed about them was that they were tired but not defeated, which is a specific thing and not easy to fake. Kyle said, "Perfect timing, this is Nadia." "Nadia, this is the guy I was telling you about." He was smiling a little too wide. I said hi. I sat down. I reached for the menu, and for about 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. It was Tabitha who slipped. She'd had one glass of wine, maybe her second, and she leaned over to say something to Damien and Priya that she clearly thought I couldn't hear. The table wasn't that big. The restaurant wasn't that loud. "I give it 40 minutes before he figures it out," she said. Damien started to laugh, and then stopped himself. I put down my menu. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I grew up in Hamilton, youngest of 3, in a house where my parents handled things quietly and taught us to do the same. I learned early that the loudest reaction is almost never the most useful one. So I didn't say anything right away. I picked the menu back up. I decided on the salmon. I took a sip of water. But I was paying attention differently now. Kyle kept glancing between Nadia and me with this expression. Expectant, a little gleeful, like he was watching a movie and waiting for the good part. Damien had his phone out, screen down but fingers close. Priya was smiling into her drink. And Nadia. Nadia was talking to me about the supply chain software her company had switched to last year, and she was making a specific point about real-time inventory tracking that was actually interesting, and she had no idea. That was the clearest thing in the room. She had absolutely no idea. I thought about leaving. I ran through it in my head, the polite excuse, the family thing, the early morning, and I knew I could do it cleanly. Stand up, make it smooth, be gone before anyone could turn it into something else. But I looked at Nadia, who was still talking, who had pulled out her phone to show me something on a spreadsheet, who was giving this dinner her full genuine attention. And I didn't leave. I made a choice. I ordered the salmon. Nadia ordered the gnocchi. We talked. Not in the polished way people talk when they're performing for an audience. In the actual way. With false starts and tangents, and moments where one of us would say something and then clarify it immediately because the first version didn't quite come out right. She worked in procurement for a mid-size manufacturer out in Mississauga. She'd been doing it for 6 years, and she was good at it, in the way that people are good at things they understand deeply, and not just technically. She had opinions about things. She pushed back on one thing I said about vendor contracts in a way that was direct without being unkind, and I found myself adjusting my position not because I felt I had to, but because she was right. Somewhere around the 45-minute mark, I caught Kyle glancing at his phone and then at Damien. Whatever they'd expected to happen, I don't think this was it. The thing was, I'd mostly stopped thinking about them. At one point, Nadia excused herself to use the restroom, and Damien leaned over and said, "Okay, so?" In a way that made it clear he was waiting for me to acknowledge the bit. Like we were all in on something together, I said. "She's great," he blinked. "I mean, she's genuinely interesting," I said. "You good?" He sat back. He didn't quite know what to do with that. It was later. We'd moved on to dessert, and the table had gotten quieter, the way tables do when the evening starts winding down, that Nadia said something that made me look at her differently. We'd been talking about weekends, what we did with free time. I mentioned I'd been trying to get better at cooking, which is only half true. I can cook 4 things well and everything else badly, and I've decided that's sufficient. She laughed at that. Then she said she'd been spending most of her weekends at home lately. "My daughter has swim lessons on Saturday mornings," she said, "and Sunday's our day. We try to get outside if the weather holds." She said it the way you say something that is entirely ordinary to you, and has been for some time. I said, "How old is she?" 7, Nadia said, "Going on 40. She'll tell you everything you're doing wrong and be right about it approximately 60% of the time." I asked her name. "Ren," she said, and the way she said it, quietly like a word she liked the shape of, I thought, this is the person. What happened next? I don't talk about much. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, and that was somehow the whole point. Kyle made a comment. I don't even remember the exact wording. Something half joking about how these two seem to be getting along, said in the tone that signals everyone's been waiting for it. Tabitha laughed. Damien got his phone out again. Priya said something I couldn't hear, but Nadia could, because I saw her expression change. Just for a second. Just enough. I put my hand flat on the table. "Hey," I said, looking at Kyle, "can I ask you something?" He looked at me with that smile still in place. Was this a setup? The smile didn't exactly disappear. It sort of calcified. I mean, we just thought, was Nadia told what kind of dinner this was? Silence. I looked at Nadia. She had her hands in her lap and she was very still in the way that people are still when they're deciding something. "Were you?" I asked her. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Kyle told me you'd just broken up with someone, that you could use a night out." A pause. He didn't say anything else. She wasn't embarrassed. That's what I remember. She was angry but contained, and she was also watching me to see what I was going to do with the information. I nodded. I turned back to the table. "Okay," I said. I kept my voice very even. "That's the last time I do this. I meant dinner plans with Kyle. They probably heard it more broadly. That was fine." I looked at Nadia. "Do you want to get out of here?" She looked back at me. "Yes," she said. "I really do." We walked about 3 blocks before either of us said anything. It was October, that specific Toronto October cold that doesn't feel brutal yet but makes you want to move fast, and Nadia had her hands in her jacket pockets and was walking like someone who'd been waiting to exhale for a while. "So," she said. "That was something." "It was," I agreed. "I want to be clear that I had no idea," she said. "In case that's not obvious, it was obvious." She glanced at me sideways. "How? You were actually listening to me talk about vendor contracts," I said. "Nobody does that unless they're either very kind or completely unaware they're being set up." She laughed. A real one. I'd heard her laugh at the table, politely, socially, and this one was different. It came from somewhere else. We ended up at a coffee place on Queen that was still open. The kind with mismatched chairs and jazz playing at a volume no one asked for. We stayed for about an hour and a half. We talked about our work, about the city, about things we'd thought we wanted in our 20s that now seemed like someone else's goals. I told her about Hamilton. She told me she was from Guelph originally, that she'd moved to the GTA after her marriage ended, that starting over at 34 in a city you only half know with a 5-year-old, who keeps asking questions you don't have answers to, is the hardest and also most clarifying she'd ever done. I said, "What kind of questions?" She thought for a second. "Last month she asked me why some families have a dad who lives somewhere else." I waited. "I told her that sometimes families change shape," Nadia said, and she said like when Play-Doh gets mixed up. She smiled at her coffee. I said yes. Exactly like that. I said, that's a good answer. I stole it from a children's therapist I saw on YouTube at 2 in the morning, she said. I steal all my good parenting answers from better parents than me. I don't think that's true, I said. She looked at me. I think you're figuring it out, I said, which is what good parents do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you're not what I expected from Kyle's pitch. What was his pitch? He said you were a solid guy who needed some fun. I considered that. I mean, he's not entirely wrong. She smiled again. That one I tried to memorize. I didn't call Kyle on Monday. I didn't say anything to any of them. I walked into the office, got my coffee, sat at my desk, and worked. Kyle tried a few times to catch my eye, and I let him try. Damien made one comment, something vague about how I'd disappeared early, and I said I'd had somewhere to be. Tabitha flew back to Calgary on Sunday. I never brought it up with her. Some things you handle loudly. Some things you handle by just not giving them the reaction they were designed to get. I texted Nadia on Sunday afternoon, which was a day after I'd told myself I'd wait. I'd had her number since the coffee place. I'd looked at it approximately 10 times and put my phone back down. I said, hey, it was really good to meet you. Despite the circumstances, she replied in about 4 minutes. Despite them, yes. How's the cooking going? We texted for the rest of the evening. I burned pasta trying to respond to a message and told her, and she sent me a voice note that was mostly her laughing and saying, you have 4 things. You said so yourself. Stick to the 4 things. I played it 3 times. We took it slowly. That was something we both wanted without saying so explicitly. The way you sometimes arrive at the same conclusion from different directions. I met Ren for the first time about 2 months in. We were at a park near Nadia's place in Etobicoke, one of those November Saturdays where the light is low and cold but the sky is an impossible blue, and Ren was on the climbing structure, and she looked down at me with an expression of complete assessment. Are you Mom's friend? She asked. I am, I said. She thought about this. She has a friend named Carol who brings bad cookies. I don't bake, I said. Good, she said, and went back to climbing. I looked at Nadia. She had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. That was it, more or less. The verdict from the person who mattered most. There's a version of this story that ends with me confronting Kyle properly. Something pointed, something final, a moment of clarity that everyone involved acknowledges as deserved. I've thought about that version. I've rehearsed it. But the truth is, the bigger thing was already happening on the other side of town. Kyle and I drifted in the way that people drift when the thing holding them together turns out to be proximity rather than actual feeling. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he was bored and thought he was being funny and didn't think very far past the punchline. Most people who do unkind things aren't doing them out of malice. They're doing them out of carelessness. That's not really better, but it's different, and the distinction mattered to me when I was deciding how much energy to spend on it. The answer was, not much. Nadia and I had been together for about 8 months when she told me she'd been offered a position with a larger firm, better title, better pay, headquarters in Vancouver, with a hybrid option that let her stay in Toronto most of the year. She told me the night she got the offer, sitting at her kitchen table with Ren asleep down the hall and a bottle of Ontario Red between us. She said, I want you to know before I decide anything. I said, what do you want to do? I want to take it, she said, but I want to know where we are first. I looked at her across the table. I said, we're here, we're solid, take the job. She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for days. Okay, she said, okay. She took the job. She was good at it, because she was good at everything she decided to be good at. She started traveling to Vancouver 4 days a month, and Ren stayed with Nadia's mother in Guelph on those trips. And I learned what it meant to miss someone with specific texture. Not a generalized ache, but the particular absence of this person, this voice, this way she touches the back of her neck when she's thinking. We got engaged on a Wednesday. That sounds unromantic, but it wasn't. We'd been talking about it for a while, the way you talk about things when you already know what you both want, but no one has said it formally yet. I'd had the ring for 3 weeks. I was waiting for a weekend, for something scenic, for the moment to be commensurate with the feeling. Then it was a Wednesday. She was tired from a week of back-to-back calls. She was standing in my kitchen in socks and one of my old university sweatshirts, telling me about a vendor call that had gone sideways, and I looked at her and thought, There is no better moment than this one. So I got the ring. She stopped talking mid-sentence. I said, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I don't want to wait for the right setting. You are the right setting. Will you marry me? She stood there for a second. Then she said, You were waiting for a weekend, weren't you? I was waiting for a weekend, I admitted. But you couldn't hold it. I couldn't hold it. She laughed. She held out her hand. She said yes, and she said it like she meant it, which she did, which is the only way she ever said anything. We got married the following September. Small wedding, Nadia's family, mine, a handful of people from each of our lives who had actually shown up when it mattered. Ren was our flower girl, which was her idea, and she executed it with the focused seriousness she brought to everything she decided to take on. She walked down the aisle holding her basket with both hands, not dropping a single petal until exactly the moment she reached the front, at which point she dropped them all at once in one decisive gesture. Everyone laughed. Ren looked satisfied. At some point during the reception, her grandfather, Nadia's dad, a quiet man from Guelph who'd driven in that morning, found me at the edge of the room and shook my hand and said very simply, Thank you for choosing her. I didn't have a polished response. I said, Thank you for raising her. He nodded. He went back to his table. That was the whole conversation. There's a story I came back to a few times in the months after all of it. About the dinner. About what it meant to stay. I've talked to people who say they never would have sat through something like that. That the moment they knew it was a setup, they'd have been gone. I understand that. I respect it, actually. There's something clean about that kind of line. But I keep thinking about what I would have missed. I would have missed a woman in a gray blazer telling me something true about inventory tracking. I would have missed a coffee shop on Queen and a voice note about burned pasta. I would have missed a 7-year-old on a climbing structure handing down her verdict on my baking prospects. I would have missed all of it. People ask sometimes what made me stay, and I usually say something vague about the situation. But if I'm being honest, the answer is simpler. I stayed because she was there, and she was clearly someone worth knowing. And every other consideration was, by comparison, pretty small. Kyle texted me once, about a year later. Just a short one. Heard about the wedding. That's actually really great, man. Congrats. I thought about it for a while. Then I wrote back, thanks. That was enough. Ren is 9 now. She has opinions about music, about which parks are good and which are only okay, about the correct way to load a dishwasher. She's right. We're all doing it wrong. She started calling me by my first name and then, without announcement, switched to something else. Not dad, exactly, but something adjacent, a word she made up herself that means what she needs it to mean. I didn't ask her to. I didn't expect it. I just tried to show up. That's the whole secret if there is one. You show up. You stay. You don't make the child prove she's worth the effort, because she isn't the one who needs to prove anything. They tried to make her mother into a punchline, a joke date, a bit to laugh about over apps and wine on a Friday night. They didn't know who she was. They hadn't bothered to find out. I found out. I'm still finding out, and every single thing I've learned has been worth knowing.